In the autumn of the year 1774, a tall, careful Englishman walked down a wooden jetty on the north shore of Borneo, looked at the small Mindanao boat that was to take him 1,000 miles east through some of the most pirate-ruled water in Asia, and stepped aboard with no soldiers, no convoy, and no plan to defend himself if it went wrong. The boat was 10 tons. She was rigged in the local way, with a single mat sail and a slim outrigger and a thatched palm shelter aft. The crew, all but one or two, were Malays, coast-born sailors of the Sulu and Mindanao islands, whose fathers had very likely gone raiding in just such boats, whose brothers very likely still did. He had borrowed the boat from a sultan, whose neighbor was the Sultan of Sulu. He had hired the men himself, one by one, in their own language. He had not, anywhere in the long list of his preparations, included so much as a soldier with a musket. And then he untied that boat from the jetty and sailed off in her for 18 months into the Sulu Sea and the Celebes and the Moluccas, and at last the coast of New Guinea. And not a shot was fired at him from beginning to end. We will come back to how that is possible. It is, when you take it apart, the entire story. You must understand what kind of sea he was about to enter, because the modern eye, looking at a map, sees only blue, and blue, the modern eye supposes, is a tolerant and uniform medium. It is nothing of the sort. The sea is not one sea, it is many seas, each with its own old custom. And the one that opens between Borneo and the Philippines was, in that century, the kingdom of a people who took their living from the water in the most thorough way a people ever has. In the chart rooms of Calcutta and Manila and Batavia they were called, with that flat, fearful simplicity that empires reserve for what they cannot extinguish, the Sulu pirates. It was not the piracy of the European imagination. No parrots, no buried chest, no black flag. It was a system. Whole towns lived by it. Long, slim, lateen-rigged warboats came out every season with the monsoon and went north as far as the Bay of Bengal, south as far as Java, east as far as the Spice Islands, and brought home not cargoes when they could be taken, but principally people, slaves, that is, to be sold at the great markets at Jolo, and set to work on the pearl banks and the rice and the boats themselves, until in the next generation, their sons would be slavers in their turn. It was a closed and self-renewing world. It had been going on for 200 years before any European ship came around the Cape with the intention of changing it. It would go on for another 100 years afterward. Into this sea, in the December of 1774, a man proposed to take a 10-ton open boat manned by his own employees. His name was Thomas Forrest. He was an officer of the Honourable East India Company, a captain in their marine, about 45 years of age, married to no one yet, of no great wealth and no particularly noble family, and of a curiosity and a patience that would have done credit to a much greater man than the company knew it had on its books. There is a portrait of him in old age that shows a long English face and the eyes of a man who has spent his life looking at things at great distances, attentively, trying to understand them on their own terms. It was an unusual face for a company servant. The company, in the main, dealt in faces that looked at the world the other way around. He spoke Malay. He spoke it the way a sailor speaks any tongue he has had to live in, fluently and without affectation, with the words for rope and rein and how much and very well, and the patience to sit for an evening on a thatched veranda and let a conversation come round to its point in the local way, which is never the way a company man in a fresh uniform expects it to come round. By the standards of his colleagues, he was a strange Englishman. He sat down and listened before he asked anything. He ate what was offered. He behaved, in short, as though the people around him were the people who lived in this part of the world, and he were the visitor, which of course was the simple and entire truth, but which it was so much the fashion of his century to forget. He had, too, the habit of writing things down. He kept a small, leather-bound book in his jacket pocket, and he wrote in it almost every day. Not the official report he would later send to the company, but something more private. The words he had learned that week, the way a particular sail was rigged, the difference between two kinds of rice and how they were cooked, the names of the men he had spoken with and what they had said. He drew, too, when there was time, small, careful sketches of boats and of stretches of coastline, of the house on stilts above the warm green water, of the way the people braided their hair. None of it was for publication. It was, for himself, the way a man keeps a private record of the only journey he is making. Most of that book has not survived. What has survived is the impression a man leaves on a place when he visits it without intending, in any sense at all, to improve it. The company had recently planted a trading post on a small island off the northern tip of Borneo called Balambangan. Directly at the threshold of the Sulu Sea, they had founded it in 1773 with much ceremony and much expense, with a garrison and a fortress and a few hundred Europeans. And they had set it down precisely at the foot of an active volcano, in the manner of a man who builds his cottage there because the view is unimpeded. Forrest had been one of the founders. He had been there 3 years. He had watched what the company's other expeditions accomplished, and how the company's flag was received. He was, I think, the only Englishman on that island who suspected what was coming for it. And then the council in Madras, casting about for a man to take a small expedition east and chart a way through the Spice Islands toward New Guinea, fixed on him. They offered him a frigate. They offered him a company of marines. He declined them politely and asked instead for the loan of a Mindanao galley and the money to pay her crew. The senior men, when they read his letter, thought he had lost his head. The company sent ships with guns. That was the company's business. A man who went out alone in a native boat with native sailors into the sea of the slavers. What was he even pretending to do? It was thought, in some quarters, that he was tired of his life and was choosing this manner of disposing of it. There was a meeting of the council, lasting most of an afternoon, at which the proposal was discussed. The minutes have not survived in full, but the flavor of the room is preserved in the fact that the request was eventually granted, with reluctance, on the grounds that no one else of comparable seniority would touch it, and that the money he was asking for was very small. The truth, in any event, was the precise reverse of what they suspected. He was not tired of his life. He had a fairly exact idea of what it was to sail, under the colors of an East India Company ship, through a sea whose every village had lost a brother or a son, to slavers flying very nearly the same colors. He had concluded that the only safe way to cross such a sea was to cross it as a guest, not a master, in a vessel that signaled in every line of her that the man aboard her had come to do business and not to instruct. He went down to the Datu of Mindanao, who owed him a courtesy from some earlier dealing, and borrowed the Tartar Galley. He hired 18 Malays, 2 or 3 of them with reputations along the coast, for matters that a man hiring sailors does not inquire into too closely. He had 1 English mate and 1 Portuguese Indian boy beside him, and that was the whole of his support against 20 million square miles of water, and whoever happened to be sailing it. He sailed at the beginning of December. The wind was right for the eastward run. The European officers at Balambangan came down to the jetty to see him off, some with that quiet face a man uses when he is being polite to a friend he does not expect to see again. He raised no flag of any nation. He had no European mark upon his boat. To a war prau coming on him at sunset, he would look like nothing whatever. A Mindanao trader carrying a few pieces of cloth and a few iron pots, hardly worth the trouble of boarding. He had thought about it the way a careful Englishman thinks about an investment, which is the only thing that Century thought about with that degree of patience. And so they slid out in the warm wind into the green water of the Sulu Sea, the very water the company's other officers were lying awake at night thinking about. And they were not, as it turned out, any more harassed by it than the people who had been crossing it for centuries. They went by day mostly, hugging the coasts where they could, anchoring under headlands at night, lighting no fires that would have shown. They met other praus. They met a great many of them. A pair of warboats came up to them one morning out of a fog in the southern Sulu and slid alongside, the men in them dark and serious and armed, and called out across the small water that separates one boat from another in such an encounter. And Forrest's people answered them in their own tongue. And Forrest himself stood up under his thatched shelter and called across some phrases that I would give a great deal to have on record. And the two boats slid by and went on. There is no account of money changing hands. There is no account of fear. The encounter is described in the journal in 2 sentences. It is mentioned in passing because nothing came of it. We met 2 armed boats of the southern Sulu and exchanged civilities and went on. There were many such meetings. Some, I am sure, took longer than the 2 sentences he gave them. He had been told, before he started, by men he respected, that the danger of the Sulu Sea was the people. He came to understand, in the course of crossing it, that the people of the Sulu Sea were like the people of any sea. They preyed on what looked like prey. They let the rest pass. And what looked like prey was very largely a matter of how a thing held itself in the water. The company's frigates, with their stiff bows and their bright colours and their gun ports, had been prey. They had announced themselves at 20 miles distance as a thing worth the trouble of taking. Forrest's prau announced nothing. She was a fact of that water, indistinguishable from 1,000 other facts of it, and she was permitted, without incident, to go about her business. I have said it was the entire story. It is, but I have to repeat it, because the people who lived in his century never quite saw the point of it. They had a theory of force. They believed, with that beautiful, inattentive confidence of Europeans of that era, that an unarmed boat in a pirate sea was a contradiction in terms. They had no theory of what Forrest had, which was harder to put on a flag, a working knowledge of the people, and the wit to use it, and the humility to ride in their boat instead of his. He came in time to Mindanao, on the south coast of the great island of Mindanao, and to the court of a man named Sultan Pacha, Maulana Kamsa, who received him as a sort of diplomatic guest from a great trading nation he had heard of, but never had the trouble of dealing with. Forrest stayed a long while. He sat on verandas with the Sultan and his visitors, and drank what they drank and ate what they ate, rice and small grilled fish, and a thin sour soup of bamboo, and a sweet of palm sugar and grated coconut that he developed, by his own admission in the journal, an embarrassing affection for and disgust in the spaces between the islands eastward. What was to be found there, which coasts a small boat might run along, which it might not? The Sultan asked him about London, about the Queen, about how the company governed its possessions in India, and Forrest answered as honestly as he could, which is to say, with more honesty than the company would have preferred. He met the Sultan's mother, who was an old woman of considerable presence. He met the man who kept the Sultan's elephants. He was shown the small fleet of war praus, and was asked to give his opinion of the way one of them had been rigged, and gave it, and was thanked. He came away with letters in the local hand addressed to chiefs further down the chain, that said in effect, "This is a friend of mine. He means no harm. Let him pass." They were better than any number of guns. He carried them folded into a small oilskin pouch through the rest of the voyage, and he produced them when occasion required, with the modesty of a man producing a passport in a place where passports are honored. From Maguindanao they ran east through the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, that the Dutch had murdered a people to keep, slipping along the southern fringe of the empire of the company's chief commercial rival, conducting themselves so quietly that no Dutch governor seems to have noticed they were there. And at length, after weeks more of beautiful indifferent water, they came up against a coast that no European had ever charted with anything like care, the coast of New Guinea. It is difficult now to describe what New Guinea was to a man in 1775, because we have had 200 years of photographs and films of it, and we know, more or less, what kind of place it is. To Forrest, it was very nearly the edge of human knowledge. The Dutch had touched it, the Portuguese had touched it, a few traders had touched it, but the inland was a rumour, and most of the coast was a guess, and the people who lived along it, Papuans who spoke none of the languages of the Malay world and whose customs were entirely their own, were, to a European of his century, very nearly the inhabitants of another planet. He went up to them in his small boat, without weapons drawn, and he met them, and he traded with them. He bought bird of paradise, feathers, and a little nutmeg and various small things, and he sat among them in their houses on stilts above the warm green water. And he watched them and was watched by them, and he wrote down in his careful hand the words for water and rain, and how much. He did this for weeks. He had not gone there to take possession of anything. He had gone, of all extraordinary things for a company servant to go for, to look. There was an instant somewhere in those weeks when he was the only European within 500 miles in any direction. His one English mate was sick by then, or had perhaps gone off with another boat. The records are unclear. He sat in the prau with his 18 Malays, off a coast that not a man in London could find on a map, among a people none of his countrymen had spoken to, and the boat rode at her anchor in a green bay, and the morning came up smoking off the trees, and he wrote in his journal a sentence about the look of the smoke. That is, in the end, the part of the story that stays with me. There he was, the only one of his kind for hundreds of miles, in the kind of solitude that would have driven other men of his century to despair or to violence. And what he did with it was write down what the smoke looked like. He turned for home in the late spring. The monsoon was wrong for a direct westward run, and so he came back the long way, through islands that had not seen a European face since the previous century, drinking the water that the chiefs sent down for him, eating the rice that the women cooked for the boat, speaking everywhere the language he had learned to speak. He came back to Maguindanao. He came back to the Sultan, who was glad to see him, gave him provisions for the last leg, and asked after the wife the Englishman did not yet have. And then he came back at last, in the spring of 1776, toward Balambangan, toward the small green island where the company had set down its great fort, and found that the fort was no longer there. A few months after he had sailed, the Zulus had finally taken offense at the fact that an enormous foreign garrison had been planted at the door of their sea, and they had come over one night in their war praus, 300 of them, and they had stormed the place and burned it and killed those Englishmen who had not had the sense to run. What was left was wreckage of stockade and a few European graves, and a coastline that had been swept perfectly clean of the company's pretensions. The settlement was gone. The garrison was scattered. The men who had stood on the jetty in December of 1774, watching Forrest sail off in his 10-ton boat, those still alive, were now refugees on other islands. The great trading port that was to have made the company's fortunes had lasted, in the end, just under 2 years. And here is the thing that has to be said about it. And there is only one thing. The company read his book. They steered by his sailing directions. They took down his bearings and his soundings and his notes on the trade winds. They used them. because those things could be turned into money. They did not take down what he had actually learned, which was not a sailing direction at all. It was that an unarmed man in a borrowed boat, with the language of the country in his mouth and the patience to sit on a veranda, could cross a sea full of slavers. And that the same sea, the moment it perceived a company frigate flying its colours, would rise up and burn its forts to the waterline. This was not a useful lesson to an empire. An empire cannot operate on it. An empire has shareholders, and shareholders prefer the cannon. So the company went on building forts and sending out frigates and getting them, here and there, burned to the waterline. The Sulu Sea remained dangerous to Europeans for another 100 years. The Sultan's letters yellowed and were lost. The crew of the Tartar Galley, the Malay sailors who took the strange, thoughtful Englishman across the world and brought him safely back, vanished one by one into their own histories. The names Forrest had so carefully written down can no longer be matched to particular men. They were called Shi Daud, Shi Tuolang, Shi Bandu, and others. They were the people who did the thing. They are not who the book is about. He sailed into the most dangerous water in Asia, and these let him through. The men who came after him sailed in larger ships, with more soldiers, and the sea answered them with fire. There is no mystery in it. He had asked the sea the right way. They did not. The water between Borneo and the Philippines has held that part of the story now for 2.5 centuries, faithfully, in the way the sea does, without comment. It does not require us to learn anything. It only goes on giving each boat that comes onto it exactly what that boat has earned. He earned passage. They earned the fire. The sea as ever is patient, and the sea as ever is fair, in a way the men who sail on it have very seldom managed to be.